Thanks, Jamie.
Agent, Clegg,
Here.
Halliburton,
Here.
Sanchez,
Here.
Thompson,
Here.
Woodings.
Here.
5 present, 1 absent.
Thank you. We've got, looking at the agenda, sorry about that, guys. So Eric is here. Eric, are you leading the presentation?
Yes, thank you, Mayor.
Great. So before Eric jumps in with budget, I just wanted to again thank you and team for the work that you're doing. Tonight, Eric has slides to discuss potential investments and allocations on the expense side of our budget. He'll walk through some kind of 30,000-foot goals as well as specifics on some of the things that council talked about last year and the year before with regard to some one-time funding. And then also from our perspective, it's these investments that staff will continue to work on for the June budget hearing that becomes so key in our recovery. And so Eric has broken things down by one-time investments that will that were planned and will bring on even more import than they did before, as well as a focus area of investment for recovery long term. And then, so that's this week, and then in the coming weeks, we'll have another conversation about the CIP, the Capital Improvement Plan. So Eric, if you'd like to take it, I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. I'm just gonna pull up my screen here. And once again, thank you for the opportunity here to be with you this afternoon and continue our conversation on fiscal year 2021 budget development. I've been in front of you the last handful of weeks. 2 weeks ago, we talked about fiscal year 2020 and revenue impacts from this COVID crisis that we're in the midst of. Last week, we focused on our fiscal year 2021 revenues, and as the mayor said, this afternoon I'll be going through our fiscal year 2021 expenses. So before I do that, I'd like to kind of highlight some of the goals that were very much discussed and prevalent as we were developing the recommendations that you'll see today. Really, 5 goals kind of rose to the top. The first one being protection of our financial resources. And as we've talked about in prior sessions, just really the importance of, retaining resources so we can continue to provide core services and aiding in the recovery of the region. We talked a little bit about deferring decisions on certain cost increases and the overall importance of maintaining our cash flow reserve and our capital fund balance for emerging needs. As discussed last week, one of our recommendations is to limit property tax growth to no more than 2%. The goal associated with that is really to support community members who are struggling, while also being mindful of our ability to address future challenges that we might be looking at within the general fund budget. You'll see as we go through the presentation today that there's a theme about evaluating existing city programming. And as we continue to advance down this journey, we're going to be looking for opportunities to reallocate funding from existing programs to higher priority programs. Again, as the mayor mentioned, investments for recovery, and that will be, I think, really prevalent as we get into the deck this afternoon. Ensuring that we are supporting our most vulnerable community members and ensuring that we are investing in areas such as housing, transportation, and climate innovation, which will lead to the recovery of our city. And finally, and we will talk about this towards the end of the presentation, public engagement has been very much a theme as we've been discussing the budget over these last really several months. And it continues to be a theme. We are being very mindful of the fact that we want to communicate our approach and seek feedback as well as we advance through this. So now I'll show a slide that I've shown the last several budget cycles. It's really just kind of a grounding slide. Per state law, we are required to develop a balanced budget, meaning that our revenues must equal our projected expenditures. And as we go through this, process each year, there's really three options to balance. One would be revenue adjustments, the other would be ongoing funding adjustments, and then the third being one-time funding adjustments. And when we make recommendations, funding recommendations, we are very much taking a multi-year view. We're looking at our available resources, obviously in the upcoming fiscal year, but also looking at what we project to have in future years and what the projected cost increases would be, and ensuring that we can meet those projected costs in future years. We do strive to make our budget really as accurate as possible. We want to avoid significant in-year or end-of-year variations within our revenues. So a theme that we'll be looking at will be, I think this budget process, and we discussed this last week for sure, will definitely be elongated as compared to prior years. We are going to need to continually revisit our revenue estimates and refine them as data becomes available around the severity and the duration of this recession. You'll also see as we look at our expenditure items, there are a number of items that we will need to come back over the coming months to provide additional detail on them as our economic picture becomes more clear. So this,
I'm going to pause just for a second to make sure that the record reflects that Councilman Bajet has joined us.
Hey, thanks everybody. I've been here by phone, but had some difficulties with the computer. So I've been here the whole time, but now you can see me too.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to move to a slide that summarizes our general fund expenditures. And this slide shows what our projected expenses would be in fiscal year 2021 as compared to the current year adopted budget. And you can see, the various categories on the left-hand side of the slide, starting with personnel. Personnel is projected to increase from fiscal year 20 to 21 by approximately 1.3%. And there are several factors that go into that percentage, which we will focus in on as we move throughout the presentation. Our maintenance and operations and equipment line is essentially holding flat. Really just under, a quarter of a percent change from fiscal year 20 to 2021. And that's been something that has, very much been actively pursued as we looked at our maintenance and operations budgets. And we do have a slide on that later, but what we did is we really tried to contain costs and bring our M&O budget in line with historical expenditure levels. And also we were very conscientious about where we assumed growth. So there were, there's probably about 2 or 3 categories, workers' comp, software maintenance being the most prevalent, where we do have growth built in. Most other categories we have assumed 0 growth. Our capital transfer, we have $12.9 million proposed for fiscal year 2021. As you look at that line, you can see that in fiscal year 2020, we had allocated $17.2 million. That was something of an anomaly. Our base level of funding has been $12.9 million. So I wouldn't necessarily look at this year as a funding reduction. What I might say is that in fiscal year 2020, we had some amount of one-time resources that we allocated towards some key major repairs and maintenance categories, maintenance projects. This year, some of those one-time resources are being recommended to be used elsewhere, as we'll get into.
Madam Mayor, this is
Go
TJ.
ahead. Yes.
Quick
Councilman.
question. Thank you. I just couldn't recall the answer to this. Are projects that were scheduled to be performed this year? I'm thinking parks projects, playgrounds, restrooms. Are those still on schedule, or have they all been pushed forward?
Thank you very much, Councilmember Thompson. There are a number of projects that have been deferred during this time, and we will have to come back with revised timelines on certain schedules due to social distancing protocols and things of that nature.
Thank you.
I won't dwell on every single line within this chart, but as you look at debt service, Idaho Humane Society, some of those categories, there is some minor degree of change. Really, I'd like to focus on the three categories at the end. One of the things that we have within this budget is a reserve for future impacts from this COVID-19 disease. And as we look at this, we wanted to ensure that we're very hopeful that we won't need to use it for this purpose, but to the extent that we encounter another situation next year where we have unexpected costs or unexpected revenue losses, that we would have a source to look to. The mayor did mention that we have funds for investments for recovery. We actually have some other one-time funds in addition to this amount that are not called out on this slide due to different funding sources and whatnot. And that we will be striving to bring additional details throughout this budget process. And then within our expenditure reduction category, we have $2 million allocated there that we will be providing additional details as we progress.
Madam Mayor.
Council President.
Thank you. Eric, question for you. Does any of this assume that we will be reimbursed for any of the hard expenditures we've experienced to date?
Thank you very much, Councilmember, for that question. I would say the assumption is that on the expenditures, that we will be reimbursed. We're very much hopeful that we will be reimbursed for those expenditures within the current fiscal year. Those expenditures are not necessarily a major factor as how we looked at fiscal year 2021, because the reimbursements will be offset by revenue losses within the current fiscal year.
Thank you. Follow up if I could though, since we already are assuming those revenue losses, I guess my question goes to, if we end up with a reimbursement, how will that be budgeted? Will that fall then to the bottom line at end of year as part of the capital transfer? Will we perhaps put a policy in place that it would go into the COVID contingency? I'm just curious how we'll handle it if and when we get it, and whether we need a policy around it.
Thank you for that question. We are kind of in the process of evaluating our other expenditure categories to determine if we will have savings to offset those revenue losses. And I guess I would say, to the degree that that we won't, I would say that those reimbursements may not be able to drop to the bottom line. It may be, that those reimbursements keep our position whole within the current fiscal year. So, we're tracking that, and I would anticipate that we'd be able to provide more information on our expected expenditure levels in the coming weeks to determine whether or not we would be able to supplement that COVID contingency reserve, or have that drop to the capital fund at the end of the year and whatnot.
Thank you.
So this slide shows our projected general fund position as we look at our forecast. Obviously in fiscal year 2021, as mentioned previously, we need to be balanced. So, we're showing a zero position there. And as you look out into the outer years, the table at the top shows our projections with a 2% property tax increase scenario. So 3.5 million, 2.6, 2.4, and 1.6. And you can see that is also demonstrated on the line chart below with the blue line. Last week at council, there was a question, what would it look like if we did a 3% increase rather than a 2% increase? And that's demonstrated on this slide on the orange line, the difference being approximately $1.6 million on an annualized basis.
Madam Mayor,
Go ahead.
thank you. So Eric, does this presume that we will take 2% just in for the fiscal year 2021, or we will continue to, I'm assuming it's only a one-time 2%, and then we will at least consider going back up to 3%. Is that the case?
Yeah, thank you very much, Councilmember. For the purposes of this this forecast, I have assumed a 2% in fiscal year 2021, our base position for the future years being 3%, and I would envision that there would be a discussion within each fiscal year about the appropriate level of increase. But we have assumed 3% in those outer years. So now I'll move to some expenditure lines or expenditure categories. And I'll first talk about a couple of items that we've talked about previously. And as we were, developing the fiscal year 2021 budget, even before this COVID event, we were striving to generate some cost savings. So the first category that we looked at was the way that we budget for personnel. And we determined that by taking a more granular approach to how we budget for each position, we would be able to identify savings. And that exercise was made possible by the implementation of budget software, for which council approved funding at the tail end of calendar year 2018. So by doing this more granular approach, and by reviewing past vacancy history and ensuring that we build, exactly what we need for the positions that we have, we were able to lower our projected budget for personnel by $1 million in fiscal year 2021. Similarly, we looked at our M&O, and we took a very granular approach, and we looked department by department, nearly line by line, and we looked at what we had spent last year for the last several years and what our projected expenses were on a go-forward basis. And we tried to right-size the budget. One of the reasons that we had funds drop to the capital fund at the end of every fiscal year looking back has been, we had some degree of M&O savings. So we looked at where we had those savings in prior years, and we looked to reduce budget. And when we looked across the entire general fund budget, we were able to reduce by approximately $1.4 million. Now, we do have some additional cost savings that we have programmed into our recommended budget for fiscal year 2021. So the first one being looking at reducing our rate of compensation growth. And we have assumed, $2.25 million for right now for that. And we are looking at both general employees and contract employees. Obviously, our contract employees subject to negotiation. And, I think it's clear, it's important to point out that this does not signal a reduction to compensation. This is really a reduction in the rate of growth. So what we have assumed in prior years has been a 3% growth factor for our general employees, and then our contract employees subject to the agreement with both our fire and police employees. So what we'd be looking at would be a lower rate of growth in fiscal year 2021. We also have built in some level of base budget reductions that will help us enable us support the investments for recovery. That $2 million that we've built in equates to just under 1% of our projected fiscal year 2021 budget. And we envision utilizing our priority-based budgeting approach, kind of taking a programmatic view, reviewing legacy programs and determining where we might be able to allocate resources to more higher priorities. And we would envision returning back to the council over the coming months as specific details are being considered and recommended.
Madam Mayor.
Go ahead, Council President.
Thank you, Eric. Back to the compensation growth savings. So you had pointed out that in the past, we've always gone with a 3% cost of living adjustment. What would that cost of living adjustment be under this reduction?
Thank you very much, Council Member. I think as we look at that, we would have to look at, how much, we might be able to realize from, negotiation with our contract employees and looking at our general employees. And I would say it would be a balance, but in general, we've assumed somewhere between, 1% and 2% lower than the 3%.
Okay, so, sorry, Madam Mayor, follow up. So that would be somewhere between 0 and 1%.
Thank you very much. I would say that it would be, 1% potentially plus, and I think that would, again, depend on the level of, I guess, concessions that we were able to realize from our contract employees. But I have not assumed a 0%. I would say that the base would be, 1%, and then we're also evaluating, potential options for, one additional one-time compensation.
Okay, so I guess what I'm getting here is the 2.25 million is a target, but we're not quite sure what the makeup of that is going to be yet.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay, thank you.
And also, I just asked Jade for some clarification on this too. The raises in the past have not been across the board, but that amount becomes the pool from which supervisors give performance raises. So it isn't a true COLA, cost of living adjustment, because not everybody has gotten the same amount, but it creates the pool from which raises are distributed.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that clarification.
Madam Mayor.
Sure, Council President.
Thank you. So Eric, on the base budget reductions and the potential to look at priority-based budgeting to look at legacy programs, I'm assuming that through priority-based budgeting, we're looking across all programs, and even some of those which might be relatively newer, we might find particular savings either based on finding more efficient ways to do them, or based on not getting the return on investment that we expected out of them. Is that true? It won't just be programs that have been around a while, it will be all programs that we'll be looking at?
Thank you for that question. Yes, absolutely. We would be looking across the board at programs, and we'd be looking at them from lots of different angles, from the expenditure side as well as from the revenue side. And
then follow up, if I could, again, as we do this, some of these obviously have constituents and constituencies. And so I guess I'm looking forward to seeing what the public engagement process is going to be, and expecting that will be pretty robust around these changes. Even though they'll be relatively small as a piece of the budget, I suspect that they will perhaps be ones that people will care a fair amount about.
Thank you, Councilmember. Yes, we do envision bringing these regularly for council, feedback and guidance as we start to develop that list.
Thank you.
So now in terms of expenditure increases, and we have talked about, I did mention kind of this investments for recovery. So we have, some significant resources included in this budget. So we have about $6.75 million in specific investments, which we'll outline in subsequent slides, covering housing and homelessness, accessibility, and transportation. Of that amount, 6.2 million being one-time resources and another $550,000 in base. In addition to that, we have an allowance in this recommended budget for an additional $2 million for investment areas such as, again, housing and transportation, economic opportunity, climate innovation, equity, and then community engagement. And we would strive to be bringing additional detail on, specific investments by the time of the June budget workshop for that $2 million. In addition, and I do have a slide on this as well, there are a limited number of historical, or I might call them longstanding priority expenditure increases, items that have been talked about at length in past sessions. And then we have essentially a bucket, or an allowance in this budget for departmental workload requests. And that allowance that we're holding is $800,000. We would envision coming back to the council later in the calendar year with specific recommendations on that, and really making that contingent upon, what is the health of our overall budget, how has COVID impacted us, and are our revenue estimates in line with what has actually happened? And then also, were we able to realize the level of savings that we have built into this budget? So as we look at, kind of those areas that I mentioned on that previous slide, let's look at housing and homelessness first. So on this slide, I've represented some very recent investments, as well as some new items that are included within this budget. You'll recall that the City Council approved an allocation of $6.1 million for major repairs and maintenance for our existing housing portfolio assets, and that that $6.1 million could be for repairs or for replacement of those assets. Additionally, at the end of the last calendar year, the council approved $2 million to go towards ending family homelessness. As part of the fiscal year 2020 budget, the council approved $325,000 in the general fund of base funds for housing and homelessness projects. And at the time that those funds were approved, we indicated that it was going to take a little bit of time to come up with specific recommendations in terms of how that funding would be used. Within the current fiscal year, we would envision looking at some of those funds to help offset forgiveness of rents. But as we look forward into fiscal year 2021, we would be looking at those funds to help support 2 new positions one being in the mayor's office for policy and strategy related work around housing and homelessness, and the other being in our planning and development services, more of a technical position to assist with grants and compliance and things of that nature. In terms of, kind of new housing projects, in calendar year 2019, the council approved $5 million for housing projects. We used $1.1 million of that to purchase land at Franklin and Orchard for a housing project, leaving $3.9 million. That $3.9 million is still unspent and available. And then as part of this budget, there's a recommendation to allocate an additional $6 million for housing and homelessness projects within our capital budget. Half of those funds being available due to repurposing funds that were formerly allocated towards the stadium. Another theme that's come up,
Madam Mayor, before we go on, could I ask a couple of questions?
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. So Eric, the top part of this slide, the 6.1, the 2, the 325, those are not additions to the 2021 budget. Those are monies that have already been budgeted. Is that correct?
Thank you, council member. That is correct.
Yeah.
Okay, and of those, it's only the 325 that's base that will be going forward. Is that also, am I understanding that correctly?
That is correct.
Okay, so within that, the 2 million for family homelessness, as I remember, there was a committee stood up that should be reporting sometime very soon. I think there's a fund set up within Idaho Housing and Finance Administration. Will be at some point distributing that $2 million into that fund. Am I correct on that? I'm just trying to remember the process on this.
That I would probably have to defer to others on that. That sounds correct to me, but I might look to Jade or we might need to return back for additional detail on that.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Clegg, my knowledge is, yes, it's roughly what you outlined. I was not involved in detail, but I can talk to Maureen as far as what trigger point, as far as progress of the private philanthropy would need to be reached before the city's funds join those private funds. We traditionally put a threshold or performance trigger, and I'm just not familiar with the details that was established there, but I can get that information from Maureen.
Yeah, thank you. That was kind of what I was looking for. And then out of the 325K in base, the 2 new positions will not take all of that, I would assume. Are we planning to support the fundraising effort? There will obviously have to be some staffing of that, and wondered how and if we're planning to support that.
That I'll jump in there. Right now, it's been our intention all along to have this be included as part of the homelessness strategy for the city. Staffing wise, both the fundraising consultant and the team of kind of volunteers involved, as well as our housing staff, Maureen, are having to determine that. And so rather than committing staff to fully staff the effort, we are trying to work with them to determine what exactly that looks like and how that builds into a comprehensive strategy to address homelessness in our community.
Great, that's wonderful to hear. I just was trying to remember how we had allocated that and what we were looking at going forward. If I could, one more question then on if we add the $6 million, we'll have nearly 8 million in a fund, and guess I'd like to understand the strategy behind how we would develop the plan for utilizing that. I think there's probably a myriad of opportunities out there, and trying to wade through them all and figure out which is the most effective and perhaps the best return on investment is going to be quite a process. So I wondered if you've done some thinking about that, Mayor.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, so the 5 million was allocated before without that clarity. And so this points to the importance, I'm like using my mouse, but you can't see what I'm pointing to. This points to the importance of having like a strategist policy person that's working with housing and PDS staff to map out the impact. So housing staff right now has looked at steps that could be taken, the relative pain of it, and then the impact that it would have. And we envision, again, rather than kind of just picking out a project when a piece of land becomes possible, instead, just as we would with homelessness, coming up with a holistic strategy to address housing. And part of it'll be land trust, part of it'll just be policy changes. But then from that, we'd come back with recommendations for how that funding is spent.
Great, thank you.
And the one thing I'd like to follow up on the 2 million for family homelessness is I would like, just if Jade or if it's Maureen could get to staff, to council and to myself, what triggers were for that funding, because given the state of affairs today, it has been my concern that that money would just be sitting there and not deployed at a moment when it's really important to deploy it. And if we determine as a committee also that fundraising is going to take longer, I mean, I'm just saying what ifs, I would like us to have a conversation about whether or not we could deploy that effectively for the here and now with regard to family homelessness, potentially, as opposed to waiting till this crisis ends and more money rolls in. So just something I think we ought to discuss, so that, you know, and also so that people, if we get to the point where the fundraising team, they might decide that it's right, they might decide that it's not at this moment. But if that's going to push it back, you know, would there be interim steps we ought to take that we should discuss as a council? And then that could also help prove out the case that this works, and then would kind of tee up future fundraising. Just as something to flag, I'm not saying that that's where things are at, but I think we ought to be mindful of the time and the need that exists.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, we had a meeting just this morning, and I know we have time on the books next week with you, Mayor, but kind of just that COVID meeting, some of these pre-existing pieces, and do we revisit some of our historical approaches to maybe in the next 6 to 8 months, not spend significant funds on kind of hotel vouchers, but maybe pivot and try to purchase some housing first units that might enable really just kind of a leap towards a housing first strategy, as well as help us through this COVID thing. So it's a point well taken, and we have time on your calendar at least to talk that through next week and then come back to the council.
Madam Mayor.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just back to the topic of the 2 million for family homelessness. As I'm recalling, when we earmarked those dollars for the family homelessness campaign, a lot of that was to help build capacity within our community organizations who are already doing that work. And as I've been kind of going around and talking to folks over the past several weeks, a lot of those organizations are bumping up against their capacity because people have more needs. And so I would hope that as we're talking about this, we're really being mindful of that, and that there's a lot of need out there right now for that capacity building, and taking that into consideration.
Yeah, that was well said. That was really getting to what I was suggesting, was that we might not want to hold the funds if there are needs and it falls within the kind of the purview or the long-term intent of the funds, which was to address family homelessness.
Yeah, I agree. And I think if we can start building that capacity now, the sooner the better.
All right, Eric, I think you can go.
Okay. I'll move to accessibility, and this was, you know, a theme that we talked about throughout the budget process last year, and continues to obviously be a very important theme. As part of the fiscal year 2020 budget, $200,000 was allocated for facility assessments to evaluate compliance with ADA standards. That $200,000, there's a recommendation to add to that with additional one-time funds in fiscal year 2021 to complete those facility assessments, with the thought being that that 200,000 won't get us through the entire city's infrastructure assets. In addition, we are anticipating having those assessments done sometime during fiscal year 2021. We do anticipate that there will be repairs needed to bring the city up to ADA standards. So within the capital fund, we have allocated $350,000 in base resources to address repairs associated with the ADA. Additionally, in the general fund, there is a recommendation to allocate $200,000 on a base level for citywide accessibility enhancements. And these would be things that would be above and beyond ADA. So, it could be anything from, and I'm just gonna provide illustrative examples. It could be things like, childcare at events or translation services for community events, to anything like, intuitive, I'm struggling for the word here. I guess it would be, you could think about intuitive design or more user-friendly enhancements to allow access, things above and beyond ADA type repairs. I guess the other theme that we called out on one of those earlier slides was transportation. And if we look back to...
Excuse me, Madam Mayor.
Yes, Council Member Sanchez.
Thank you. Eric, before we left that discussion about the ADA enhancements, will we have an opportunity to receive some input from the public about some of those needs? I know in some conversations that I've had with the public, I'd heard about some requests that, I don't think we normally think about. So for example, in addition to possibly having things like, baby changing tables in bathrooms, but also perhaps having an adult changing table in a bathroom. So I think it's important for us to provide opportunities for the public to let us know, because we don't always know what those needs are. So just wondering if there's going to be an opportunity for that.
Thank you, Council Member. I have talked with our ADA coordinator about different opportunities, and I think that they are, developing an approach for how we would look at that $200,000. But most definitely, engaging with the public and trying to find different opportunities is a part of that plan.
Madam Mayor, Councilor Sanchez, I think what we anticipated to do is, once we had completed those initial assessments, we would post those to the public and then go through some open house or feedback mechanisms to make sure the assessment has hit the right needs of the community, and make sure we don't have any gaps that maybe the technical people who are assessing the facilities missed, which happens. So we very much want to make sure the public feels like we've identified and prioritized the right improvements to facilities.
Great, thank you.
As we look at transportation, you'll recall that last year the City Council had set a goal of funding VRT at an amount equivalent to 5% of our property taxes. And we also were able, as part of last year's budget, to increase our funding contribution on a base level in the amount of $1 million. for both addressing capital needs as well as route enhancements. Some of the funding dedicated to route enhancements wasn't able to move this year due to this event. So, we can look forward in fiscal year 2021 to seeing additional routes above and beyond what we saw this year from the funding that was allocated as part of the last year's budget. Additionally, I think there will be opportunities to explore additional route enhancements in fiscal year 2021, looking at that investments for recovery funding, as well as looking at, potentially the city council strategic planning contingency. So that's very much a theme that we're looking at and actively engaged in conversations with our partners at VRT.
Madam Mayor.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Eric, am I correct that because we didn't have to deploy the FY 2020 route enhancements, that is money that would have gone into the base, and because we'll now potentially be spending it as one time as capital, it over time it reduces the base, right, for next year? Am I right on that, or am I missing something?
Councilmember, maybe just a little clarification on the question. Is the question that because we allocated money for capital that we would be able to reduce our capital contribution in future years?
No, I'm just wondering what impact it has on the base by delaying the base funding a year, or does it do that given that we'll still be deploying that money but using it for capital and not routes? I was trying to figure out if there will be any gain on the base.
Thank you for that question. No, I don't anticipate there being a gain on base when you look at fiscal year 21 as compared to fiscal year 2020. Where the gain would be the deployment of those resources towards routes, a portion of those resources towards routes rather than capital on a go-forward basis. But our overall contribution,
Would be good. Okay, thank you.
I mentioned earlier in the presentation that there is funding for some historical expenditure increases or longstanding items that have been discussed in previous sessions. Those items include the addition of 5 new police officers, some operating impacts associated with capital projects that have been or are anticipated to be complete in fiscal year 2021, including our micro district, the Heyman House, and then a number of parks assets. We do anticipate annual maintenance associated with a procure to pay or purchasing system. That system will be beneficial in terms of reduced growth levels necessary to keep up with the volume of purchasing that we're seeing in the city. In the fire department, as we look at the number of retirements, and this was a strategy we needed to employ last year, and we'll probably need to employ this year as well. One-time funding to support academy costs. There is a level of funding that is built into the fire department for academy-related costs. However, with additional recruits comes additional costs, and we typically address that on a one-time basis based on the number of anticipated recruits. We added funding as part of the fiscal year 2020 budget for a refresh of our zoning ordinance. And when we added that, we anticipated that being really a 2-year effort. So the second year of funding is included in fiscal year 2021 at a reduced level based on anticipated need. We do have funding above and beyond the investments that we talked about previously for energy initiatives being led by our Public Works Department, and then one-time funding for the continuation of the Downtown Mobility Initiative.
Madam Mayor?
Done.
Yes, there's just one thing I'd hope that we can have a discussion about, again, I'll bring it up in the future so that we can see if it has enough support to seek some sort of approval, is that adding that fourth firefighter at Station 5 to each shift at Station 5 to look at the costs, hear from potentially the interim chief or and weigh the support level, because it's not something I've poked around and asked everybody, but at some point, just to get that out there, have that and either move on or see if it's something we're interested in pursuing. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councilmember. Moving on to kind of the proposed timing. And, I did mention that there are a number of items that we will be, striving to come forward with additional detail as we progress through the budget cycle and through the calendar year. Those base budget reductions, when we were talking about, evaluating our legacy programs, we are going to strive to, identify those programs and bring them forward for, city council debate and discussion and review over the course of the coming months. We would hope to reach some conclusion on those items, no later than the end of the calendar year. You extend too much further beyond that, and it's going to be difficult to make that $2 million target. So, we will be coming forward with additional details there. On the $2 million bucket, base bucket for investments for recovery, coming forth with recommendations by the time of the June budget workshop. The reduced salary growth, and evaluating opportunities there. We would, strive to come forward with detail on that before the beginning of the fiscal year. And then our departmental workload requests, we would hope by fall of 2020, that one we are, making somewhat contingent upon, what we know about the economy and our ability to generate savings in other areas. So as we have a better sense of those items, we'll start to develop recommendations and again, bring those recommendations forward for city council review and approval. I mentioned that one of the goals was to preserve flexibility for future COVID-19 impacts. And as a theme, we talked about this a lot last week. It is really kind of unknown what the duration and severity of this recession truly will be, and therefore its ensuing impact on our general fund revenues. But as we advance into fiscal year 2021, we do have an allowance for a potential continuation or flare up of this event again, covering whether it be revenue loss or unanticipated expenditure items. That amount we have built in at $3.2 million. We also have built in money within the base, $2.5 million. Just again to be conservative and to allow for some level of event like this potentially happening in the future.
Madam Mayor?
Sure, go ahead.
Just a quick question, and you may not have an answer better than that's what you could come up with, but what led you to 3.2 million for this contingency?
Thank you, Mayor, thank you, Council Member. The 3.2 million, we had originally kind of envisioned around 2.5 million. We are working right now to project what those costs above and beyond what's budgeted this year might be, but it might be somewhere in that ballpark. Obviously, our revenue losses in the current year in conjunction with those anticipated expenditures are north of that $3.2 million number. It would be difficult to project, the level of magnitude of this event in perpetuity. And we, some of the impacts from the current fiscal year will be offset by expenditure savings in other areas. But that 3.2 million aligns nicely with, the projected unbudgeted expenditures in the current fiscal year.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful.
And then as we look at contingencies, above and beyond that amount, we do have other contingency funds assumed in fiscal year 2021. Obviously, the City Council strategic planning contingency at $524,000. Now that amount, normally we set at $600,000 or $500,000, and then we assume 100,000 of it being available for base items, $400,000 being available for one-time items. So
Eric, do you have that on a slide?
Sorry, thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thanks.
As we look at that contingency account, as part of the fiscal year 2020 budget, we went into the year with a $600,000 allowance, essentially allowing for ongoing items from the prior fiscal year to advance. And what we did is in fiscal year 2020, due to the fact that there weren't ongoing items, we dropped it from 600,000 to 500,000. Now this amount here is not 600,000 because there were two items that were approved during fiscal year 2020 by the council that have implications into fiscal year 2021. One being the McMillan Elementary after school care, and then the other being a housing item championed by Councilmember Sanchez that had a 2-year duration. We also have funds within our operating contingency, unallocated funds. I mentioned the second year of the ADA facility assessments. That's where we're housing them in that operating contingency for next year. The grower housing amount, and by the time of the budget workshop, we'll have a better number here. 325,000 we carried last year. That number would be reduced by the value of those two positions. But to your point, Councilmember Clegg, it would leave some level of additional funding for that purpose. And then funding to advance priority-based budgeting initiatives, studies and evaluations and programmatic things like that. We carry each year funds for our revenue neutral contingency. There is an offset on our revenue side for that as well. Similarly with property tax contingency. And then finally, downtown maintenance. This funding is associated with the sunset of the Central Urban Renewal District almost 2 years ago now. We've been holding money for potential repairs and investments, and that funding was supported by additional property tax that came to the city associated with the sunset of that district. Last week, there was a discussion around public engagement, and we are continuing to work on what that public engagement approach would look like. And obviously, it's a little different than we had originally envisioned in this, era of social distancing and being apart from each other. But what we're envisioning right now would be, a couple of things. First being, kind of a web-based education / feedback opportunity where the mayor, as well as, potentially the budget office, could share assumptions, goals, and recommendations, both via interactive opportunities, looking at potentially, Facebook Live or YouTube events, as well as a pre-recorded video that would allow, residents that might not be able to tune in at the appointed hour to go in and look at the materials, as well as provide feedback and or questions on any of that body of work.
Eric, can I just highlight, Mayor, council members, the other reason for doing the recorded version is it allows us to do closed caption and language translation that is more difficult when we're in a live video setting. So this would enable us to reach some broader audiences if we do it recorded as well as live.
Thanks, Jade. And then we're also looking at, ways to, reach more of our vulnerable community members. And what we're looking at are, a couple of things. One would be, employing kind of the trusted messenger approach. So reaching out to partners out in the community that have kind of embedded relationships with different vulnerable communities. And, as part of that outreach to those trusted messengers, applying lessons learned, not only from this current event, this COVID event, but also the work that was done on census outreach. And then also exploring, phone-in opportunities for those that might not have internet access.
Madam Mayor,
Or
if
go
I
ahead.
could really quickly, just on the public outreach, we've not typically done this kind of outreach, so it's new. I'm glad to hear you exploring all these things. Guess I would say that it would be really valuable, I think, for council members to be part of any interactive stuff so that we can hear firsthand from people what their concerns are, whether we're part of the presentation or not, at least being in the audience so that we can hear folks instead of having to get that secondhand. I'd really appreciate that opportunity.
Yeah, I actually had meant to suggest the change to the slide that clearly listed you guys, because I think that's important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll move to kind of our upcoming budget milestones, and then stand for any questions on any of the content here.
And we've just got to be mindful of time because we do have an executive session.
Thank you, Mayor. We'd envision returning for another update, whether it be next week or the week after, on our capital improvement program. Following up, and it looks like it would need to be on May 19th rather than the 26th due to the Memorial Day holiday, for a discussion on our enterprise funds, both airport as well as our public works funds. Again, releasing our budget document on June 12th, a very abbreviated version as compared to prior years. Our June budget workshop on the 23rd, and then kind of concluding with our public hearing in July.
Madam Mayor.
Go ahead, Council Member Sanchez.
Thank you. Eric, I meant to mention in your previous slide where we're talking about doing more interface with YouTube and that sort of thing. One thing that I observed in trying to do videos and such in promotion of Census 2020 at City Hall is I feel we have the need for a soundproof room. There were several times where we were waiting to not hear the geese, to not hear the construction that was happening downtown, to not hear the buses going by. And if we're going to be doing more of this from City Hall, if you could put somewhere in there that we probably should put some effort into creating a soundproof area where we can do that in a way that's more professional. Thanks.
Thank you, Council Member. Yeah, as I'm working with public community engagement on this approach, we'll certainly incorporate that.
Madam Mayor, Jimmy here.
Yeah, go ahead, Councilman.
Eric, thank you so much for the presentation at this point, and thank you for the slide on accessibility. On your upcoming budget milestones, is the public outreach component basically now between 6-12, or when does the public outreach really fit into the milestone and the timeline that you got presented here?
Thank you very much, Councilmember, for that question. I probably should have put that. I would envision it's really between now and that June 12th date.
Thanks, Eric. I really appreciate that. I guess that would be my one question would be if that budget document released, if it was later, if there would be more potential for public outreach that that was in person, if we were looking at closer toward the end of some of the stages that we're about to enter as far as reopening the community, and if there might be some opportunities that would be a little bit closer. I know that timeline is tight, but closer towards that end date where there may be some opportunities for more real discussion to occur. But I know that that's difficult to do.
I'm
Yeah.
going to suggest that if you have suggestions or questions related to engagement, that you send them through Amanda. We can compile them all, because I'm looking at time and we do have quite a bit to go over in executive session. And so we need to move on. We can, if you send stuff, we can get answers to those in advance, or at least take in suggestions and have that be part of what becomes more fully baked moving forward. I think that we all need to, though, to recognize that we don't want to not have engagement early with the hope that we'll be able to be in person later, because it is likely that even beyond the phases, we'll still be looking at how we conduct hearings and gatherings in different ways than we have before. And so I just want to say that, like, it's the continual theme of let's be careful not to make ourselves believe and be falsely hopeful that we can all be back together by a certain date to then have the large gatherings that we've had in the past, because we just don't know yet. With that, could we take a motion to go into executive session so that, yeah, and
Sorry,
then we're
Madam
gonna,
Mayor,
we all have to hang up here after we vote, like fully hang up. And then staff has been waiting in the other teams thing for a while. So we'll go there next.
Madam Mayor, I
Yes.
move we go into executive session, labor contract, Idaho Code 74206-1J.
Second.
We have a motion, a second. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
My apologies. Bagent,
Yes.
Clegg,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Thompson,
Yes.
Woodings.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
Great,
you
see y'all
there.
on Teams.